The snow fell steadily over Millridge, its tiny flakes spiraling down like whispers from the sky. Holly Bennett tightened her grip on the steering wheel as she turned onto Main Street, the town's once bustling heart now quiet and drowsy beneath a heavy blanket of winter. She hadn't set foot in Millridge in over a decade, not since her family had moved away after what everyone politely referred to as the tragedy. Yet here she was, driving past old haunts that looked frozen in time, with every turn of the car dragging her deeper into memories she wasn't sure she wanted to relive. She had come back to escape her own mess. The noise of city life had grown unbearable, her job had been a series of disappointments, and her last relationship had ended in an explosion of words she wished she could take back. Coming to Millridge was meant to be a reset, a place to breathe, to gather herself, and maybe even find a trace of the girl she used to be. As she drove, her eyes scanned the familiar rows of shops, their windows glowing softly against the gray afternoon. The bakery still displayed its trays of fresh pies, the hardware store its rows of tools and snow shovels. But one shop caught her eye, a store that hadn't been there before. Tucked between the florist and the cafe was a small, unassuming building with a dark wood facade. Above the door, a carved sign read, "The Candle Maker." Something about it made her slow the car. The windows glimmered with the warm glow of candlelight, flickering in a way that felt alive. She pulled over, turning off the engine and stepping out into the biting wind. The snow crunched underfoot as she approached the door, a strange pull drawing her closer. The bell above the door jingled softly as she entered, and immediately, Holly was engulfed by a cocoon of warmth and light. Shelves stretched to the ceiling, lined with candles of every shape, size, and color. The air was thick with the scent of beeswax, cinnamon, and something else, something older, deeper, like the faintest trace of wood smoke on a winter night. "Good afternoon," came a voice from behind the counter. Holly turned to see an older man standing there, his hands dusted with what looked like flecks of wax. He wore a neatly pressed shirt beneath a dark apron, and his silver hair was combed back, giving him an air of timeless elegance. But it was his eyes that held her attention, pale gray, almost silver, and filled with an energy that felt both warm and unsettling. "Hi," she said, a little awkwardly. "I was just looking." "Of course," he smiled faintly. "Take your time. Each candle here is unique. They tend to find the person they're meant for." Holly raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "Every candle tells a story," he said, his voice smooth as honey. "Sometimes they carry messages, little truths, meant for those who light them, but only when the time is right." Holly gave a polite smile, brushing it off as a clever sales pitch. She wandered the aisles, running her fingers over the smooth wax of the candles. Some were intricately carved into shapes of forest scene, a roaring fire, a blooming flower. Others were simple and unadorned, their beauty lying in their perfection. But one candle stopped her in her tracks. It was small and plain, its white wax flecked with delicate gold. There was nothing particularly striking about it, yet Holly couldn't look away. She picked it up, the weight of it solid in her hand. "That one," the man said from behind her, startling her. She hadn't heard him approach. "It's been waiting a long time." "For me?" she asked, half joking. "For someone," he said cryptically. "Perhaps today it's found its match." Holly hesitated. "How much is it?" The man shook his head. "That one's a gift." "A gift?" He nodded, his expression calm but unreadable. "Some things cannot be bought." Feeling a little off-kilter, Holly thanked him and left the shop, the candle tucked in her bag. The cold hit her as soon as she stepped outside, but it wasn't enough to shake the strange warmth that lingered from her encounter with the candle maker. Back at her rented cottage, Holly set the candle on the small wooden table by the window. The cottage was cozy but sparsely furnished, most of her belongings still in boxes scattered around the room. She lit the candle, watching as the flame caught and began to burn steadily. A soft, golden glow filled the room, and for the first time in weeks, she felt a sense of calm. She leaned back in her chair, letting her eyes drift closed. But moments later, something made her snap them open. The smoke rising from the candle wasn't behaving as it should. Instead of dissipating into the air, it swirled in tight, deliberate circles. Holly leaned forward, her heart thudding in her chest. Slowly, impossibly, the smoke began to form Shape's letters. Remember the lake? The words hung in the air for only a moment before dissolving into nothingness, leaving Holly staring at the empty space where they had been. The lake. Her breath hitched. She hadn't thought about it in years, not since that day. The lake had been her favorite place as a child, a sprawling expanse of water surrounded by dense forest. Every summer, she and Emily would spend hours there, playing hide and seek, collecting rocks, and whispering secrets. But one summer, everything had changed. They had been playing near the water's edge when Emily disappeared. Holly had heard a scream and run toward it, but by the time she reached the spot, Emily was gone. All that was left was her best friend's scarf snagged on a tree branch. Holly had told the adults what she saw or thought she saw, but no one believed her. The search for Emily had lasted weeks, but the lake had given up no clues. In the end, the official story was that Emily had wandered too far and drowned, though her body was never found. Holly had carried the guilt of that day ever since, wondering if there was something she could have done, something she had missed. Now, staring at the candle, she couldn't shake the feeling that it was pointing her back to that place. That summer had marked the beginning of an invisible wall she built around herself. Every failed relationship, every decision to keep people at arm's length, traced back to that moment by the lake. What right did she have to happiness, knowing she couldn't save her best friend? The next day, she found herself driving to the lake. Snow covered the ground, muffling her footsteps as she walked toward the frozen water. The sight of it made her stomach churn, the memories of that summer flooding back with painful clarity. As she reached the shoreline, she froze. Nestled in the snow, just a few feet from the water's edge, was another candle identical to the one she had brought home. Her breath caught. She picked it up, her hands trembling. Scratched into the bark of a nearby tree were 3 words: "Find the truth." The drive back from the lake was a blur, the second candle resting on the passenger seat like a silent witness to her growing unease. Holly's mind churned with questions, memories, and a gnawing sense of dread. She hadn't been to the lake in years, yet now it felt as though it were pulling her back into a story she had no desire to revisit. The words carved into the tree, "Find the truth," lingered in her mind like a challenge. What truth? And why now? By the time she reached her rented cottage, the daylight was already fading, and the sky had turned a bruised shade of gray. Holly placed the second candle on the table beside the first and stared at them, their identical simplicity unnerving in its precision. She thought about the candlemaker's cryptic words. They tend to find the person they're meant for. Was this his doing, or was something else at play? Holly grabbed her coat and car keys, her frustration boiling over. If the shopkeeper had answers, she was going to get them. The bell over the door jingled as Holly pushed her way into the candlemaker. The shop felt even warmer than before, its shelves glowing with golden light. The man was behind the counter, polishing what looked like a brass candle snuffer. He looked up as she entered, his expression calm and knowing. "I was wondering when you'd return," he said, as though she were an old friend stopping by for tea. Holly's jaw tightened. "What are you playing at?" "Playing?" His eyebrows lifted in mock surprise. "I assure you, I'm quite serious about my work." She slammed her hand on the counter, her voice rising. 2 candles, 2 messages, and both of them are about something I've spent my entire life trying to forget. What's going on? How do you know about the lake? The shopkeeper regarded her for a moment, his silver eyes sharp and unflinching. Then, without a word, he turned and disappeared into the back room. Holly hesitated, torn between anger and the fear of crossing some invisible line. Before she could decide whether to follow, he returned, holding a small leather-bound book. "Sometimes," he began, setting the book on the counter with care, "the answers we seek are not entirely our own. They are shared with others, woven into stories that span time and memory. "What are you talking about?" Holly demanded, though her voice had softened. He opened the book, flipping through pages of elegant handwritten notes. "This shop is not just a place for candles, it is a place for truths. Each candle carries a fragment of a story, and those fragments find the people who need them." Holly's heart thudded in her chest. "Are you saying this is magic?" "Magic is merely a name we give to what we do not understand," he replied, closing the book. "But yes, if it helps you to think of it that way." She stared at him, her skepticism warring with the undeniable strangeness she had already witnessed. "Why me? Why now?" He tilted his head, his expression softening. "Because you have been avoiding the truth for too long, and because someone else has been waiting for it to come to light." Back at her cottage, Holly couldn't stop replaying the shopkeeper's words. Someone else? Who? The answer felt maddeningly close, like a name on the tip of her tongue. She lit the second candle, her hands trembling as she struck the match. The flame flickered to life, and the smoke began to swirl. This time, the letters formed more quickly, as though the candle itself was eager to speak. "Ask her." Holly's breath caught. "Her?" she whispered aloud, but there was no one left to ask. Or was there? Her mind turned to Emily's mother, Mrs. Whittaker. Holly hadn't seen her since the summer Emily disappeared, but she remembered the woman's grief, raw and all-consuming. Everyone in town had whispered about how Mrs. Whittaker had never accepted the official story. She'd claimed Emily hadn't drowned, but had been taken, though, by what or whom, she could never say. Holly grabbed her coat and headed for the car. If anyone could help her unravel this, it was Mrs. Whittaker. Mrs. Whittaker's house was at the edge of town, a small, weathered structure surrounded by frost-bitten hedges. Holly hesitated on the porch, her hand hovering over the doorbell. What if Mrs. Whittaker didn't want to see her? What if this stirred up old wounds better left closed? But the memory of the candles, their messages pushed her forward. She pressed the bell, and a faint chime echoed inside. After a long pause, the door creaked open. Mrs. Whittaker stood there, thinner and grayer than Holly remembered, but her eyes were just as piercing. "Holly," she said, her voice soft but steady. "I didn't think I'd ever see you again." "I wasn't sure if I should come," Holly admitted, "but I need to talk to you about Emily." Mrs. Whittaker's expression flickered, a mix of surprise and something Holly couldn't quite place. She stepped aside, gesturing for Holly to enter. The house was dimly lit, the air thick with the scent of lavender and something earthy, like dried herbs. Holly followed Mrs. Whittaker to the living room, where a fire crackled softly in the hearth. "You've been carrying this for a long time," Mrs. Whittaker said, sitting in a worn armchair, "haven't you?" Holly nodded, her throat tight. "I never forgot her. But now, something's happening. These candles, they keep sending me messages. They're telling me to remember the lake and find the truth. And now they're telling me to ask you." Mrs. Whittaker leaned back, her gaze distant. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then she reached into a small wooden box on the coffee table and pulled out a faded photograph. She handed it to Holly. It was a picture of Emily, but not the way Holly remembered her. In the photo, Emily was older, her hair longer, her eyes shadowed with something unreadable. And beside her stood a figure Holly didn't recognize, a tall man with a serious expression. "This was taken 2 years after Emily disappeared," Mrs. Whittaker said quietly. Holly's stomach dropped. 2 years? But how? "She came back, briefly," Mrs. Whittaker said, her voice trembling. "But she wouldn't stay. She said it wasn't safe, that she had to go back. I tried to stop her, but she was so afraid." "Afraid of what?" Holly asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Whittaker shook her head, tears brimming in her eyes. "She wouldn't say, but she left this behind." She reached into the box again and handed Holly a small, unlit candle. It was identical to the ones Holly had found. Holly stared at the candle Mrs. Whittaker had handed her. It was identical to the ones she'd found, the same white wax, the same delicate gold flecks embedded within. Her mind raced with questions. How could this be possible? What connection did Emily, Mrs. Whitaker, and the candlemaker share? And why did it feel as though the candles themselves were pushing her toward an answer? "Where did you get this?" Holly asked, her voice tight. Mrs. Whitaker exhaled slowly, her hands trembling as they gripped the edges of her chair. "Emily left it behind the last time I saw her. She told me it was important, but she wouldn't explain why. I've kept it all these years, waiting for a sign, something to tell me what to do with it." Holly's eyes flicked to the photograph still sitting on the table. The man beside Emily loomed larger in her mind now, his presence unsettling. "Who is he?" she asked, pointing to the image. Mrs. Whitaker hesitated, her gaze dropping to her lap. "She called him Elijah. I don't know much about him, only that he was the one who brought her back to me. But he wasn't from here. He wasn't ordinary." "What do you mean?" Holly pressed. Mrs. Whitaker looked up, her eyes sharp despite the weariness in her voice. "I mean, he knew things he shouldn't have. He spoke about the lake as if it were alive, as if it had taken Emily and given her back. But he also said she wasn't safe here, that something had followed her. I didn't understand it then, and I still don't." A chill ran down Holly's spine. The lake, the candles, the cryptic messages, they were pieces of a puzzle she couldn't yet see fully. But one thing was clear. This Elijah was a key to understanding what had happened to Emily. "May I take the candle?" Holly asked. "I think it might help me figure this out." Mrs. Whitaker nodded, her expression softening. "If anyone can find the truth, it's you. Emily trusted you more than anyone." That night, back at the cottage, Holly placed the third candle on the table beside the others. She sat in the dim light, the weight of everything pressing down on her. The photograph was tucked into her pocket, the man named Elijah now a haunting presence in her thoughts. Holly lit the third candle. The flame caught quickly, flickering brightly before settling into a steady glow. She held her breath as the smoke began to rise, swirling in intricate patterns, before forming words that seemed to pulse with urgency. "He is waiting." The words dissolved, leaving Holly gripping the edge of the table. Her mind raced. Was it Elijah or the candlemaker? Her instincts told her it was the latter. The shopkeeper had known too much from the beginning, his calm demeanor masking an ocean of secrets. Holly grabbed her coat and keys, her determination outweighing her fear. The town was quiet as Holly drove through the snow-dusted streets. The candlemaker's shop stood at the end of Main Street, its windows glowing faintly in the darkness. She parked and hurried to the door, her boots crunching on the icy sidewalk. The bell above the door jingled softly as she stepped inside. The warmth of the shop wrapped around her, but this time it didn't feel comforting. It felt like a trap. The candlemaker was waiting behind the counter, his silver eyes glinting in the candlelight. "You've returned," he said, his voice calm but edged with something Holly couldn't place. "You know why I'm here," she said, her tone sharper than she intended. She pulled the photograph from her pocket and placed it on the counter. "Who is he? And what does he have to do with Emily?" The candlemaker's expression shifted, a flicker of recognition passing across his face. He picked up the photograph and studied it for a moment before setting it down. "Elijah," he said softly. "He was one of us, a maker." The candlemaker gestured to the shelves surrounding them, his voice steady as he spoke. "We are keepers of stories, of truths that cannot be spoken outright. Our candles hold fragments of memory, pieces of the past that demand to be remembered. Elijah was a maker, but he strayed. He sought to manipulate the truth for his own ends, to control what was meant to unfold naturally." Holly felt a cold knot form in her stomach. "And Emily? What happened to her?" The candlemaker's gaze softened, his expression almost sorrowful. "Elijah found her by the lake. He took her into the space between, where memories and reality blur, where time is neither here nor there. It's a dangerous place, one that can shatter the mind. Emily was trapped there for 2 years before he brought her back." Holly's chest tightened. "Why didn't she stay? Why didn't she come home for good?" Because she was marked, the candlemaker said, his voice heavy. The lake had claimed her, and once it claims someone, it doesn't let go. She was never truly free, even after Elijah returned her. Holly felt a wave of nausea. The lake, the candles, the cryptic messages, they were all connected in ways she couldn't fully grasp. What am I supposed to do? Why are the candles showing me this? The candlemaker leaned forward, his silver eyes locking onto hers. Because the truth doesn't end with Emily. It's bigger than her, bigger than you. The lake is calling again, and it needs a keeper. Someone who can carry the stories it holds, someone who can balance the scales. Holly shook her head, her heart pounding. I don't understand. Why me? Because you were there, he said simply, and because Emily trusted you. The words hit Holly like a physical blow. She thought of the laughter she and Emily had shared by the water, the promises they had made as children. Now, those memories felt like the foundation of something far darker. We'll always be together, Emily had said, twirling her scarf like a ribbon. No matter what. Holly had laughed, promising the same. But promises didn't matter when faced with the cold, cruel reality of the lake. As Holly left the shop, the cold air biting at her cheeks, her mind was a storm of questions. The candlemaker's words had given her pieces of the truth, but the full picture still eluded her. She thought of the lake, frozen and silent, hiding its secrets beneath a layer of ice. The final message echoed in her mind, he is waiting. Whoever or whatever was waiting, Holly knew she couldn't run from it anymore. The truth wouldn't let her. As Holly knelt at the edge of the lake, memories surged unbidden. Emily's laugh, her scarf fluttering in the summer wind. They had once stood by this very water, their hands clasped together as children. We'll always protect each other, Emily had said, her voice bright with youthful certainty. Always, Holly had promised, her voice just as sure. Now, decades later, that promise echoed in her mind. This was for Emily not just her memory, but the truth she had left behind. The lake loomed before Holly, vast and silent under the pale light of the moon. The frozen surface shimmered like glass, the jagged edges of the surrounding forest casting shadows that stretched toward her like clawing fingers. The words of the candlemaker echoed in her mind. The lake is calling again, and it needs a keeper. Her breath fogged in the cold air as she stepped closer, every instinct screaming at her to turn back. But she couldn't, not now. Clutched in her gloved hand was the candle Mrs. Whitaker had given her, the last piece of a puzzle she didn't fully understand. The wax felt warm against her skin, as if alive, and the faintest scent of wood smoke lingered in the air around it. She knelt at the lake's edge and struck a match, the flame flaring bright before settling into a steady burn. The wind stilled, the world seemed to hold its breath. As the smoke began to rise, Holly saw the first flicker of movement. The surface of the lake shimmered, the ice beneath her feet creaking ominously. The smoke twisted into letters, their shapes glowing faintly in the darkness. Step forward. Holly hesitated, fear clawing at her throat, but the pull was undeniable. Slowly, she stepped onto the ice, each step sending faint cracks radiating outward. The lake seemed to respond to her presence, a low hum vibrating through the air. The further she walked, the more the world around her seemed to change. The trees blurred, their sharp outlines fading into shadowy impressions. The stars overhead began to swirl, their light reflecting on the ice in dizzying patterns. And then she saw him. A figure stood in the center of the lake, his outline sharp against the shimmering void. His coat billowed in a wind Holly couldn't feel, and as she approached, his face came into focus. It was the man from the photograph. Elijah. I was wondering how long it would take, he said, his voice low and resonant. His silver eyes glinted with a light that wasn't entirely human. You've done well to make it this far. Holly stopped a few feet away, her heart pounding. Who are you? She demanded. What do you want from me? Elijah tilted his head, his gaze piercing. I am a maker, like the one you met in the shop. But where he seeks to preserve stories, I seek to shape them, to use them. And you, Holly, are standing in the middle of one that has been waiting to unfold for far too long." Her hands trembled as she held the candle between them. "What does that have to do with Emily? What happened to her?" Elijah's expression darkened, a shadow crossing his face. Emily was an innocent, caught in the lake's web. It is a place of memory, a place of balance. When she strayed too close, it took her. I brought her back, but not without cost. She became a part of the lake's story, and it would not let her go. "I thought I could change the story," Elijah admitted, his voice heavy with regret. "She deserved more. I thought, if I brought her back, I could give her a life the lake had stolen. But I was wrong. It doesn't let go, not without consequence." Holly's voice broke. "She's dead, isn't she?" Elijah hesitated before nodding. "Her body is gone, but her essence remains. The lake holds her now, just as it holds so many others. It remembers them. And now it has chosen you." The words hit her like a blow. "Why me?" she whispered, tears brimming in her eyes. "Because you carry the weight of her story," Elijah said. "Because you were there when it began, and now you must help finish it." The ice beneath Holly cracked loudly, and she stumbled, the sound echoing in the stillness. The candle in her hand flared, its flame growing impossibly bright. Elijah stepped forward, his presence overwhelming, as if the very air bent around him. "You have a choice," he said. "Take her place. Become the keeper of the lake's stories, or leave and let its power remain unchecked." Holly's breath hitched. "Unchecked? What happens if I leave?" "The lake's hunger grows," Elijah said simply. "Its reach will spread, and more innocence will be claimed. The balance will be broken." Elijah hesitated, his silver eyes dimming with something akin to sorrow. "I believed I could control the lake's power, bend it to save Emily and others like her. But I was wrong. The lake's balance doesn't tolerate interference. It punished me for my arrogance." He clenched his fists. "I wanted to rewrite its rules, to stop it from taking anyone else. Instead, I became part of the cycle." Holly stared at him, her anger softening. "And now? Do you still seek control?" "No," he admitted, his voice barely a whisper. "I've seen what happens when the scales tip too far. Now, I only want the story to end as it should naturally. Perhaps through you, the lake will finally find peace," Elijah murmured. "And maybe, so will I." Her mind raced. The weight of the decision crushed her chest, but deep down, she knew there was only one answer. She thought of Emily, of her laugh and the light in her eyes. She thought of Mrs. Whitaker, waiting decades for a daughter who would never truly return. Holly stepped forward, her heart steady despite the fear clawing at her. "I'll do it," she said, her voice firm. Elijah nodded, a flicker of something like approval crossing his face. "Then light the final candle." Holly knelt, the ice cold against her knees. She struck another match and lit the candle, its flame bursting to life with an intensity that made her flinch. The world around her dissolved, the lake's surface shattering like glass to reveal an endless void of light and shadow. She felt herself falling, the sensation both terrifying and exhilarating. And then, everything stilled. Holly found herself standing on the shore of the lake, the morning sun breaking through the trees. The ice was gone, replaced by calm, rippling water. The candles were gone too, their weight lifted from her hands. But something had changed. She could feel it in her chest, a deep connection to the water before her. The lake whispered to her now, its voice a chorus of memories and stories. The lake spoke not in words, but in sensations and images, a child laughing by its shores, a man leaving an offering of wildflowers, a mother searching its depths for a lost son. Holly felt their weight, their grief, and their joy. She understood now. Her role was not just to guard the lake, but to carry its stories, to hold its memories steady so they would not consume. The lake showed her its hunger too, a deep void that grew restless without a keeper. Her duty would be to keep it balanced, to listen to its calls and ensure it did not claim without reason. It was a burden, yes, but also a gift to protect others from what she had suffered. As she turned to leave, a flicker of movement caught her eye. Near the edge of the water, faint and shimmering like sunlight on the surface, stood Emily. Her smile was soft, her eyes filled with a peace Holly had never seen before. "Thank you," Emily whispered, her voice carried on the wind. "I was never truly gone," Emily added, her voice soft but steady. "You kept me alive, Holly, in your memories, in your heart, and now you've set me free." Holly felt a warmth spread through her chest, the weight of years lifting. "Goodbye, Emily," she whispered, tears blurring her vision as her friend's form faded like morning mist. Holly felt tears spill down her cheeks as she nodded. "I'm sorry I couldn't save you." "You did," Emily said, her form fading slowly. "You saved us all." Back in town, Holly walked into the candlemaker one last time. The shopkeeper looked up from his work, his expression unreadable. "You did it," he said, not as a question but as a statement. Holly nodded. "The lake has its keeper now." "The lake has always called someone," the candlemaker said, his voice like the crackle of a hearth. "Emily was the bridge, but you are the guardian now. One day, your candles will guide another to the truth. And so it goes, as it always has." He gestured to the rows of candles surrounding them. "These are not just wax and wick. They hold fragments of those who have come before keepers, seekers, innocents claimed and freed. The lake gives them to me, and I give them to those who need them most. That is my role." Holly tilted her head. "So you're a keeper too?" He shook his head, smiling faintly. "Not quite. I am a messenger. I light the way for others, but the burden of the lake, that is yours now." The candlemaker smiled faintly. "Then you understand the burden and the gift." Holly left the shop without another word, stepping into the crisp winter air. She knew her life would never be the same. But for the first time in years, she felt whole. She had found her truth, and in doing so, she had become part of something far greater. A story written in water and smoke, carried on the whispers of a lake that would never forget. In the weeks that followed, Holly found herself drawn to the lake every morning. It whispered its needs softly, stories it wanted remembered, offerings it required to stay balanced. She began leaving small tokens at the water's edge, wildflowers, smooth stones, even a candle lit with her own hands. The townspeople, unaware of the lake's secrets, started to notice her presence more. One day, a young boy approached her at the water's edge, his hands clutching a stone. "My grandma said this is lucky," he said, placing it in her palm. "Maybe it'll help." Holly smiled, tucking the stone into her pocket. Moments like these reminded her that her role was not just about the lake, but the people it quietly touched. Holly found herself listening to their stories, hearing their griefs and joys with a new understanding. Though they never spoke of the lake, she could see its influence in their lives. She realized her role wasn't just to guard its power, but to act as its bridge to the world. As Holly drove past the lake on her way home, she glanced at its surface, calm and unbroken. For a moment, she thought she saw a flicker of movement, a shadow, a ripple, but when she looked again, it was gone. The lake was quiet, its secrets safe. For now. As Holly drove away, she realized she wasn't leaving the lake behind. It would always be with her, a part of her story. But for the first time, she felt at peace. The lake no longer held her in fear, it held her in purpose.